Hey friends, tonight, let's explore the fuzzy tail-wagging world of medieval working dogs. Because yes, your dog might be cute, but can it guard a goose pen from midnight foxes? Probably not. And back then, failing to do so could mean someone's dinner and dignity was ruined. So before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. Feel free to comment your location and local time down below. I'd love to know where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin the night inside a cold stone hall, the kind where wind whistles through the slits they call windows, and everything smells faintly of wet wool garlic and disappointment. But outside, past the moat and through the fog, there's movement, small, low to the ground alert. It's not a knight. It's not a squire. It's Geoffroy, the watchdog. Yes, Geoffroy. Not Sir Geoffroy, just Geoffroy. He's a sturdy mastiff mix with jowls like saddlebags and a bark that could shake loose the frost from the trees. His job, guard the lord's estate, including the wine cellar, the pigs, and the aforementioned goose pen. Contrary to what fairy tales suggest, castles weren't all duels and feasts. Most nights were quiet, dull, and dark. Perfect conditions for theft, especially when your local night watchman was more interested in ale than alarms. That's where dogs like Geoffroy came in. You see, in many medieval households, especially outside the wealthiest castles, dogs were the first and last line of defense. Forget motion detectors or cameras. What you had was instinct teeth and the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bribed with coins, but might bend for a scrap of salted pork. Dogs were stationed strategically, one by the barn, one by the kitchen, one by the goose pen. Honestly, geese might have done the job themselves, but they're notoriously dramatic and a bit stabby. They weren't treated as pets in the modern sense. They were working animals, and with a job came a certain degree of respect. At night, they'd patrol with their handlers, or sometimes alone. If someone approached the outer gate or tried slipping through the hedgerow, they'd alert everyone before the poor soul could even consider climbing a wall. And no, they didn't sleep in velvet cushions. Most had a hay corner or a warm spot near the hearth if they were lucky. But make no mistake, even the crustiest landlord knew that a good dog meant fewer missing hens and more restful sleep. Now, here's where it gets amusing. Some dogs were so good at their jobs, they were given names, collars, and even little brass medallions, a sort of proto-ID tag. In monastic estates, watchdogs might be blessed, or even included in estate records as valued property. If Geoffroy performed especially well, he might be mentioned in a steward's ledger. One hound brindled fierce and loyal, no stolen hams this fortnight. And don't think this was limited to big estates. Even humble crofts had their canines. A peasant's dog might be less regal, but no less important. These dogs guarded turnip patches like sacred relics and would snarl at anyone daring to lean over the fence with suspicious intent. There's a charming, though slightly bizarre record from a 13th century village in Normandy, where a dog named Pommel was recognized in the local court. Why? Because he'd bitten the same traveling salesman 3 times in 2 years. Apparently, Pommel had a keen sense for exaggerators, and yet despite their importance, dogs weren't always safe from suspicion. If a crime occurred and no human culprit could be found, sometimes even a dog could be tried. That's not a joke. There are real instances of animals, including pigs and dogs, being brought before magistrates accused of everything from theft to witchcraft. But let's stay on the light side tonight. Imagine Geoffroy, trotting his rounds in the mist. Every so often, he pauses to sniff a gatepost or growl at an owl. His coat is thick. His eyes are always scanning. He knows the difference between a clumsy villager and someone who's really up to something. You don't mess with Jeffroy, especially not when the sun goes down and the only thing standing between your loaf of bread and a thief's hands is a dog with a job. Here's a fun twist. Watchdogs were sometimes trained not just to bark, but to escort intruders to guards, like a very stern tour guide. Right this way to the dungeon, sir. Of course not all were fierce. Some simply kept watch by being there big looming and enough of a deterrent on their own. Much like putting up a beware of dog sign, even if your dog only wags and sneezes. But back then there was no sign. Just the presence of a creature that didn't speak, didn't sleep much, and had a sixth sense for nonsense. And scholars still debate whether dogs had an official rank in the manorial hierarchy. Some claim they were barely above livestock. Others argue they held an almost ceremonial place, especially in noble courts, where a well-trained hound could mean prestige. Perhaps it's both. And as you lay there cozy and warm, imagine Jeffroy settling near the door, sighing contentedly as the fire crackles. He's done his rounds. No foxes tonight. No suspicious footsteps. No chaos. Just peace. The kind of peace you can only get when someone else is doing the watching. And Jeffroy, he's not just a good boy. He's essential. Oh, and if you ever wonder whether medieval dogs dreamed of chasing bandits, they did. Loudly. Every third night. 3 fun facts to end this shift. Some watchdogs wore collars with spikes not just for intimidation, but to protect their necks from wolves. Geese were often considered co-guards with dogs, the medieval dynamic duo nobody asked for. The Latin word canis, dog, shares roots with the word canny, meaning clever or alert. Coincidence? Sleep on it. Outside the castle walls, where the woods start to whisper and the leaves rustle like half-forgotten rumors, another kind of dog patrols. This one isn't pacing the stone perimeter or glaring at goose thieves. No, this is a sleeker creature, leaner, hungrier for excitement and rabbit stew. It's a hunting dog, and not just a hunting dog. Mind you, the hunting dog of a local baron who, like all self-respecting medieval nobles, treats hunting less like a hobby and more like a daily affirmation of masculinity power and the right to wear tights in public. You're now standing just behind him. No, not the baron. The dog. His name is Florestan, and he's a greyhound with the posture of a ballet dancer and the confidence of someone who knows they'll never have to chase a chicken again in their life. See, dogs like Florestan weren't just functional, they were status symbols. Having a well-trained hunting dog was like owning a sports car, a yacht, and an Instagram-worthy brunch spot all in one. And unlike most medieval luxuries, these dogs were fast obedient and could actually fetch things. Florestan, along with his pack, spends his days trotting beside horses, waiting for the horn call. That means go get the boar or find the hart, or occasionally follow the sound of yelling because someone fell off their saddle again. When the chase begins, it's chaos wrapped in elegance. Horses pound the earth. Falcons scream from the sky. They love being dramatic. And the dogs weave between the trees with perfect practiced grace. Boars run. Dogs pursue. The noblemen shout things in French, then immediately contradict each other. This is not hunting for survival. This is hunting as theater. A medieval Netflix special, if you will, performed live with barking and hooves. instead of CGI. And here's the kicker after the hunt. Florestan doesn't eat scraps off the ground. He gets meat from the Lord's table, served in special carved bowls. He's groomed daily. He may even sleep indoors, yes indoors, with rugs and everything. The average peasant barely had shoes, but Florestan had a cushion. By the way, this cushion embroidered with thread, possibly gold. It's worth noting that hunting dogs had categories. There were greyhounds like Florestan for speed bloodhounds, for tracking mastiffs for brute force, and even small lapdogs. Yes, lapdogs for court ladies who liked to attend the hunt but didn't want to actually get involved in all the mud and boar tusks. And did these lapdogs ever actually help? No. They sat there and looked adorable in their tiny hunting coats, which, yes, were a thing. In fact, coats for dogs weren't purely decorative. They helped protect these precious hounds from the cold scratches and the occasional poorly aimed arrow. Sometimes the coats had family crests sewn into them, because why shouldn't your dog represent your bloodline while biting a deer in the thigh? There's even a manuscript illustration, somewhere around the 14th century, showing noble women dressing their dogs before a hunt with the same reverence you might reserve for a royal banquet. The dogs, as far as we can tell, didn't object, and Florestan, oh, he knew he was important. If medieval dogs had social media, his account would be full of misty forest selfies, shots of raw venison, and captions like chasing goals. Now here's where things get a little weirder. There are surviving poems, actual poems written in praise of hunting dogs. One particularly flowery verse compares a greyhound's eyes to the moon and its stride to the dance of angels. Clearly, someone had a little too much spiced wine after a successful deer chase, and while most dogs were identified simply by their color, or job noble dogs often had full names, not nicknames, names, like Florestan Arabelle Tristan, or my personal favorite Snarlinga. Yes, that's real. Some castles even kept a kennel master, a full-time staff position, dedicated entirely to managing feeding and training the dogs. If that sounds excessive, remember that nobles often measured their prestige, not just by how many dogs they had, but how well behaved they were. Imagine throwing a dinner party where your greyhound sits quietly by your side while the neighbor's terrier pees on a tapestry. Who wins? Social points, Florestan, obviously. And scholars still argue, was this just vanity, or did dogs genuinely reflect noble values? Were they respected colleagues in sport, or just furry extensions of human ego? The answer is probably yes to both. And while you're lying there under your blanket, consider this in a world where most people never saw a hot bath or tasted citrus. There were dogs trotting through forests, wearing velvet and gold, dining on pheasant, and occasionally being serenaded by poets. If reincarnation is real aim for Noble Dog next time, here are your 3 delightful takeaways for the night. Some hunting dogs had titles like the Baron's Swiftest or Guardian of the Hawk Perch. Way more prestigious than Spot. There's a surviving dog collar from the 13th century made of brass and silk. It belonged to a greyhound. You're not imagining the envy. One nobleman left specific instructions in his will that his best dog receive a pension in meat and housing until death. That's loyalty from both ends. Somewhere between the foggy hunt paths and the stone steps of a great hall lies a tail-wagging truth the history books often skip. Medieval dogs were dressed. Not occasionally, not just for portraits, but regularly, especially if you were noble and your dog was important, which of course it thought it was. Tonight, you wake inside a quiet manner on a rainy morning. There's a low fire in the hearth. The air smells like wet moss and beeswax, and at your feet is a small figure wrapped in burgundy velvet. No, not a child. It's a spaniel. His name is Toulouse, and he's wearing a coat worth more than your hypothetical monthly rent. Now, why would a dog need clothes in the Middle Ages? For the same reasons people did honestly. To stay warm, to show status, and occasionally to be the most fashionable creature at court. In places like England and France, where fog sticks to your boots and dampness becomes a lifestyle, dogs without thick coats needed the extra layer. Toulouse isn't a hunting dog. He's a companion to a baroness who insists he has delicate sinuses and sensitive feelings. She commissioned his coat from the same tailor who hems her sleeves. It's quilted lined in rabbit fur and has tiny brass buttons down the side. Somewhere on the inside flap is an embroidered message, property of Lady Isabel. Pet at your peril. Was this excessive? Oh, absolutely. But medieval nobility wasn't about subtlety. And dressing dogs wasn't just indulgence, it was symbolic. Your dog, like your falcon or your squire, reflected your refinement. If your hound looked regal, you looked regal. There are even accounts of dogs arriving at court and coordinating outfits with their owners. Picture it, a duchess in green velvet, with a poodle in matching green satin. One of them licks its own nose during the audience with the bishop. And it's not the duchess. The coats weren't all decorative, though. Working dogs wore garments, too. In colder regions, dogs who patrolled castles or accompanied guards sometimes had rough-spun wool coats for warmth. Think of it like medieval dog PPE. And if your dog was involved in hunting, especially in winter, it would wear a padded vest to prevent scratches from brambles, or worse, an accidental jab from a spear. One particularly odd manuscript from 14th century Bohemia even describes how dogs who guarded noble children wore soft leather coverings with bells. The bells supposedly would jingle to alert a nursemaid if the child wandered too far from their watchful hound. So yes, dogs had accessories, and not just coats. There were collars studded with decorative medals, engraved nameplates, silk ribbons, and in one truly eyebrow-raising example, a tiny hat. We don't know if the dog wore it willingly. Probably not. But here's something deliciously academic. Some historians argue that dressing dogs was a way to humanize them, to emphasize their connection to the family. Others suggest it was meant to civilize the animal, marking it as a creature of the hearth, not the forest. Still not everyone approved. Certain monks were scandalized by the expense of dog clothing. In a particularly judgmental letter, one friar wrote of a lady who gave her lapdog a mantle of scarlet while the poor freeze barefoot at her gate. Which, fair point. But the dog was very cute. You're likely imagining a lot of tiny coats now. Rightly so. But not all were small. Mastiffs and greyhounds had their own garments too, some lined with chainmail if they were expected to encounter danger. Yes, chainmail for dogs. You didn't think a boar hunt was without risks, did you? Let's also pause for a strange aside. There was a brief trend in one French duchy where lapdogs were scented. Their coats were perfumed, usually with lavender or crushed rose petals, so that their presence was pleasant during mealtimes. Your dog may not enjoy the bath now, but imagine being sprayed with floral oil before dessert. So next time someone calls dog clothing modern nonsense, feel free to remind them that in 1357, a terrier named Alphonse wore a cape lined in swan feathers to a winter banquet. It's worth asking, were the dogs aware of their couture? Did they strut more, bite less, sleep better, knowing they looked good? We'll never know. But I like to believe that Toulouse, curled by the fire in his little velvet coat, feels very important. And maybe, just maybe, he dreams of walking into a council meeting with all eyes on him. Except the steward. The steward always sneezes around dogs. 3 gentle facts to wrap this up. A 15th century Spanish tailor once included 2 dog coats in a noblewoman's account book listed under necessary garments. Dog clothing was so popular in some courts, thieves targeted just the coats, leaving confused but naked dogs behind. There's a surviving coat fragment in a museum in Paris, believed to have belonged to a dog named Goose, possibly the most fashionable non-human of 1390. Now let's take a slow turn from lapdogs in embroidered coats to somewhere quieter, cooler, where the air smells of wax-old parchment and slightly damp stone. You're in a medieval monastery. Everything is hushed dim and heavy with incense, except for the faint sound of paws. You're not hallucinating. Padding softly beside the abbey's stone corridor is a dog. Not a fierce guard, not a velvet-clad noble hound, just a calm, medium-sized mutt with kind eyes and an important mission emotional support. Before modern therapy, dogs were a thing some monasteries had their own version. These weren't trained psychologists in fur coats. They were just there. And that, it turns out, was more than enough. In the strict and silent lives of monks who spent most of their hours praying, copying texts, and trying not to fall asleep during matins at 2 a.m., dogs offered something quietly healing: companionship, warmth, the occasional head to pat when the world felt a bit too eternal. And while you won't find this in many formal records, because monks weren't exactly live tweeting their dog cuddles, there are scattered references. Marginalia with tiny dogs doodled in the corners. Notes about the little brown beast who follows Brother Anselm. A journal entry that simply reads, "He did not bark during Mass today." A good sign. It wasn't just monks. Nuns too often kept small dogs for companionship, particularly in convents where interaction with the outside world was limited. A pup could be a link to something simpler, soothing even when the prayers felt heavy. And while they weren't official therapy dogs, they served the same purpose we recognize today: emotional grounding in a demanding environment. Some were orphan strays, taken in out of kindness. Others were gifts from patrons' noble families, offering small dogs to abbeys as tokens of goodwill, and maybe hoping to get a few spiritual bonus points. And these dogs, they had names: Benno, Fidelis, Clara, Never Spot, Never Fang. These were dogs with literary souls. Imagine one now, curled beside your bench, as you listen to Gregorian chant echoing across ancient stone. Outside, the world is all plagues and power struggles. But in here, the only thing that matters is whether Fidelis gets his share of leftover bread crust. Even some abbots, known for being stricter than a tax collector during Lent, allowed dogs in their quarters. Better the company of a loyal beast than the idle chatter of men, one wrote. A bit harsh on humanity, but the sentiment stands. Of course, not everyone approved. Some theologians argued that animals in holy spaces were distractions. One particularly grumpy bishop wrote that a barking dog in a monastery is a devil in fur. But this same bishop also banned cheese on Thursdays, so maybe we don't take him too seriously. And here's the odd part. Despite their quiet presence, some of these monastery dogs became local legends. There's one tale from an abbey in northern Italy about a dog named Milo who would walk grieving visitors from the gate to the chapel and sit quietly beside them. The monks believed he was divinely guided, or maybe just really empathic. In England, a Cistercian record from the 1200s mentions a dog who would lie beneath the scriptorium tables while monks copied manuscripts. He warms the feet and chases the mice, one monk noted. More diligent than several brothers. Again, ouch. Let's talk accessories, because even monastic dogs had some flair. Collars were simple leather, often with carved wooden tags bearing a cross or the monastery's symbol. Not for fashion, but for protection. There were even blessings specifically for animals in some liturgical texts. Bless this creature, O Lord, that it may bring peace and not distraction. Scholars debate whether these dogs were truly part of the spiritual community or just tolerated extras. But the quiet frequency of their appearance in side notes and stories suggests they were loved. Even in a place built for ascetic living, a little bit of tail-wagging joy was welcomed, and for good reason. In an age when most lives were harsh and brief, and the divine often felt distant or stern, a dog's loyalty was tangible, steady, present, a paw against the cold, a warmth on your feet, a pair of eyes that ask for nothing except your nearness. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture it, the flickering candlelight in a quiet chapel, the sound of soft chanting, and the gentle sigh of a dog lying beside your robe, content just to be near you. 3 little facts, soft and soothing as the silence in a cloister. Some monks named their dogs after virtues like Pax, peace, caritas, charity, or veritas, truth. Not bad role models. In certain abbeys, dogs were quietly assigned to elder monks to keep them company through long winters. One 14th century psalter features a doodle of a dog licking a monk's foot during prayer. Scholarly consensus. Definitely a real moment. The wind is rising again, this time across open fields, low rolling hills blanketed in early morning mist. You're somewhere in the countryside now, and the rhythm is slower, steadier. Here dogs don't wear gold-threaded coats or nap on monastery tiles. They move with the herd. You stand beside a shepherd. He's leaning on a crooked stick, staring into the fog like it owes him money. Beside him trots a wiry dog with a white muzzle and a tired but noble look. Her name is Mira, and unlike the hunting hounds or castle guards, she doesn't bark unless there's a reason. Mira is a sheepdog, and in the medieval world, that made her indispensable. See, while castles got all the glamour and battles stole all the songs, most of medieval life happened out here, among sheep mud, and a surprising number of rude geese. Livestock was wealth. Wool was currency. And if you lost your flock, you might lose your winter food, your rent, or your life, which is where Mara came in. From sunup to sundown, she'd weave behind the herd, nipping ankles with surgical precision, guiding the fluffier and less motivated toward greener patches. She understood hand signals, whistles, and more than one curse word. Her brain worked faster than some local magistrates and with fewer bribes. These dogs weren't trained in fancy kennels. Their lessons came from long walks, stern voices, and watching older dogs do the job. A puppy would grow up trailing the herd, learning every twitch of the shepherd's hand and every sigh of the sheep. By 2 years old, they'd be running the show. Mara's reward, a scrap of bread, a pat on the head, and the occasional nap in a pile of wool. Luxury? No. But for a medieval sheepdog, it was a pretty sweet gig. Now here's where it gets unexpectedly tender. Sheepdogs often lived their whole lives with the same shepherd. In places like Wales, Scotland, and the Alps, these dogs were more than tools. They were co-workers, companions, and sometimes the only other living soul around for miles. There are tales of shepherds who spoke more words to their dogs in a day than they did to humans in a week. Honestly, relatable. And they weren't always nameless. Bran, Cairn, Lupo, Mara. Their names are scratched into old farm records, ballads, and even wills. In one 13th century Scottish estate roll, a shepherd's dog is listed as a loyal beast of great worth, who shall not be sold nor traded, but kept with honor. For a world that often overlooked animals, that line hits different. Let's not forget the work was hard. These dogs braved wolves, thieves, and weather that would make a modern city dog weep into its paw booties. They crossed frozen rivers, slept in snow, and stood between sheep and danger more times than any human wanted to count. Sometimes they saved lives. There's a story, part record, part legend, from a Breton hillside where a sheepdog chased off bandits trying to steal a flock. She took a sword cut to the leg but lived. The villagers called her La Gardeuse, the Guardian. They gave her a place by the hearth and reportedly a small wool cloak that she hated but tolerated. Of course, not all stories are dramatic. Some are just quietly lovely. A diary fragment from a German shepherd, the humankind, in 1389, describes his dog licking dew from wildflowers and nudging him awake on cold mornings. She never asked why we walk. She only walked with me. It's a side of medieval life, often forgotten, soft, sturdy, and loyal. Even academic circles have their little arguments where sheepdogs, officially recognized by guilds or just passed along as part of oral shepherding tradition. One scholar argues they were an unrecorded but vital backbone of rural Europe. Another says, honestly, they were better at their jobs than half the people. And here's the thing, they weren't bred for beauty or prestige. They were chosen for brains, bravery, and heart. If a pup couldn't manage sheep, it didn't get pampered, it got repurposed. But if it could, it was gold. And tonight, as you settle deeper into your blanket, maybe you can hear Mara's soft panting as she watches the last lamb shuffle into the fold. Her tail wags once. She lies down at the gate, her nose twitching in the wind. She'll sleep with one eye open just in case. 3 quiet facts to leave in the pasture with you. Some medieval shepherds carved tiny wooden statues of their dogs as charms, believing they brought luck and protection. In certain regions, dogs were taught to guide sheep by moonlight because grazing didn't stop when the sun did. A few monasteries actually borrowed shepherd dogs during lambing season, paying in cheese and extra bread. Now picture this, the marketplace, not the kind with linen stalls and politely labeled honey jars. No, this is the medieval kind, loud, muddy, chaotic, and alarmingly goose-heavy. A woman yells about turnips, someone's arguing over the price of a shoe, and somewhere a lute is playing 2 notes over and over, like it forgot the rest of the song, and cutting straight through the middle of this glorious mess. A dog pulling a cart. Yep. Welcome to the era of the working cart dogs, the unsung delivery drivers of medieval life. You're watching a scrappy terrier mix named Hobnob trotting dutifully along with a tiny wooden wagon strapped behind him. Inside, loaves of bread, a few damp vegetables, and a wheel of cheese tied with rope like it's trying to escape. Hobnob doesn't question his job. He just gets on with it, with ears up, tail wagging, 0 days off. In towns and villages across medieval Europe, dogs like Hobnob were pressed into service as miniature draft animals. They were small, strong, and surprisingly reliable, especially for short, repetitive routes. For bakers, butchers, or market sellers without a horse or even a decent donkey, a good dog was the next best thing. And these weren't fantasy stories. There are actual record city ordinances, in fact, mentioning dog carts, especially in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In some places, there were even rules about the size of the cart and the width of the wheels, because apparently, even medieval bureaucrats needed something to regulate on slow afternoons. So why dogs? Well, because they worked cheap. A bit of meat here, some old bread there. No complaints, no union demands. They could navigate narrow streets, dodge people, and didn't mind a puddle or two. Plus, if anyone tried to steal the goods, the dog might growl or even nip. Theft deterrent included. Of course, not all dogs were cut out for cart duty. Some were too excitable, others too easily distracted by roast chickens. But the right dog, that was a little four-legged miracle. A cart, a harness, and a steady gait. And you had yourself a mobile grocery unit. And here's the best part. Medieval people loved these dogs. Kids would follow them through the market, laughing at their determined little trot. Older folks would toss them scraps. One account even mentions a dog named Gamel, who delivered soup from a monastery to a leper house every morning, and returned by lunchtime, tail wagging pot empty. Academic footnote here, some historians believe these dogs were precursors to the more formal dog-drawn milk carts used in the 19th century. Others argue it was just a practical solution born from necessity and ingenuity. Either way, the result was a minor miracle on pause. Now not every town loved this trend. Some wealthier cities saw it as undignified and banned dog carts entirely, claiming they got underfoot and caused wheel disorder. There's a fabulous letter from a city official in Bruges complaining about one particularly rude dog who barked at the mayor and overturned an onion stall. No details on whether the dog was reprimanded or promoted. And believe it or not, some dogs developed routines. One would go from bakery to inn to apothecary, always in the same order. Locals would greet it like a postal worker. There's a record of a baker in Poitiers leaving his bakery in the care of his dog cart duo when he went for lunch. Customers knew to take one loaf and leave one coin. And yes, someone absolutely stole too. But mostly, people respected the hustle. A dog working the market was seen as honest, dependable, and here's the kicker, more trustworthy than a lot of humans. You couldn't bribe Hobnob. You couldn't sweet-talk Gamel. They had a route. They had cheese to deliver. They had pride. Some even had bells attached to the cart, not to be cute, but to let people know they were coming. You'd hear a jingle, 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 and step aside smiling at the approaching little merchant. And here's your wonderfully weird fact of the evening. One medieval tavern kept a dog cart team to bring fresh ale barrels from the cellar. Not for show, not for fun, just because it worked. So, tonight, as your room falls quiet and your own street sleeps outside, imagine Hobnob trotting down a cobbled lane, tiny wheels creaking moonlight on his ears, doing his rounds one last time before curling up in a nest of straw behind the bakery. 3 light-hearted facts to tuck under your pillow. In some towns, children were hired to walk alongside the dog carts to guide them, protect the cargo, or just to make sure the dog didn't take a nap halfway. Certain festivals included races between decorated dog carts, Bets were made. Pride was won. Cheese was lost. One preserved cart from a Flemish village had faithful Toby carved into its side, along with tiny paw print stamps, possibly the earliest version of a dog brand logo. It's night now, not just evening, but proper medieval night. The kind where torches sputter against thick fog, and every creaking branch feels like a whisper from the woods. But you're not afraid, because you're not alone. Beside you is a dog. Not the snuggly kind. This one's all muscle and purpose. A nose like a compass, eyes that miss nothing, and a gait that says, I know something's wrong before you do. Meet Alice, a medieval tracking dog. You're shadowing a local bailiff, and Alice is his best colleague. Together, they roam the outskirts of a village where someone's livestock has gone missing. Again, the clues. A few bent fence posts, some prints in the mud, and a slightly panicked pig. So far, classic Tuesday. Now, long before Sherlock Holmes ever put on a hat, medieval folk were already relying on four-legged detectives. Dogs like Alice were trained to follow scent trails of thieves, lost children, escaped prisoners, or wandering drunks. Especially wandering drunks. And they were good. Shockingly good. Alice could follow a scent days old across fields, through markets, and straight to the suspect's door. Which meant that in the absence of surveillance cameras, medieval justice had paws. One famous type, the bloodhound. Known in Latin texts as Canis sagax, the wise-nosed dog. Not called blood because of gore, thankfully, but likely from blooded, as in noble lineage. These dogs weren't bred for cute, they were bred for judgment. In parts of England and France, sleigh hounds or lyme hounds were regularly used in criminal investigations. Think CSI, but with more fur and fewer plot twists. If someone fled the scene of a theft or attack, a trained dog would be brought in to sniff an item of clothing, then lead the party, bailiff villagers, sometimes an annoyed monk, straight to the culprit. If the suspect had a conscience, they usually surrendered halfway out of embarrassment. A few towns even had official dog handlers paid by the local court to maintain these tracking animals. Their job included feeding training and ensuring the dog wasn't distracted by sausages along the route. A full-time role, decent benefits, possibly more job security than a blacksmith. But here's where things get fun. Tracking dogs didn't just solve crimes, they became known for it. There's a record from 1298 about a dog named Morris in Burgundy who helped identify 3 sheep thieves and later refused to walk past their house. The villagers took that as divine judgment and gave Morris his own bowl at the tavern. Academic circles still debate how much dogs really contributed to justice. Some claim their role was symbolic, encouraging confessions. Others say these dogs were so precise, even nobles feared them more than clerks with quills. One chronicler wrote, "The dog knows what men forget." Poetic, slightly spooky, and probably accurate. Of course, sometimes dogs were wrong. Or maybe the humans were. In a rare case, from a Flemish court, a dog was said to have led the constable in circles 3 times about the baker's house before sitting down and refusing to move. The baker was cleared. The dog was offered a pie crust in apology. Then there's the case of Perrault, a hound mentioned in a town record from Brittany. Perrault once tracked a missing purse across half the village through a cabbage cart and into a barn where, surprise, it was hanging on a hook. Whether this was skill or accident is unknown, but the record ends with Perrault was fed with eggs and praised heartily. As all detectives should be, Now let's talk accessories. Because naturally, tracking dogs had gear. They wore thick leather collars, often with metal studs, not just for protection, but to let everyone know this was no ordinary mutt. Some even had bells to alert villagers of an approaching hound of justice. A few dogs were rumored to have padded paw wraps for rough terrain, though it's unclear whether those were functional or just early medieval fashion risks. And while most dogs worked locally, some were sent across regions to assist in high-profile cases. One record from 1321 details a dog traveling 50 miles with a constable to aid in a missing person search. No word on whether they packed snacks. Tonight, Alice finishes the trail. She pauses outside a hut. Ears perk, tail stiff. She's certain. Inside, the suspect is pretending to sleep, unaware that justice now comes with floppy ears and excellent tracking skills. And as you lie there, cozy and safe, just remember, somewhere in a damp corner of a medieval village, a dog is solving crimes with nothing but a nose and an unshakable sense of right. 3 curious, sniff-worthy facts to leave you with. Some medieval laws allowed evidence found by dogs to be used in court testimony. If that's not trust, what is? Certain abbeys bred justice dogs specifically for use in regional law enforcement. A medieval proverb, trust the dog, if not the tail. Arguably still good advice today. Morning. Again. This time, bright and loud. The kind of morning where the sun's already halfway up, before the town remembers it has chores to do. You're in the heart of a medieval fairground now. The air smells like roasted chestnuts, horses' sweat, and unearned confidence. Jugglers toss flaming sticks. Merchants shout about socks you didn't ask for. And somewhere near the maypole, someone is dramatically falling off stilts. But wait over near the puppet tent. Something unexpected catches your eye. It's a dog, on 2 legs, wearing a tiny hat. He bows. The crowd applauds. And just like that, you've met the medieval performance dog. Let's be honest, history classes didn't prepare us for this part. They taught kings and crusades, but they forgot the part where dogs danced, played dead, and maybe juggled apples. Well, okay, maybe not juggled. But some of them did backflips. These dogs weren't knights or guards. They were entertainers. Sidekicks in traveling shows, comedic relief in street performances, and sometimes the whole act themselves. And they had jobs too, to amuse the masses. You watch now as the little dog, his name, according to the nearby announcer, is Sir Boffin, leaps through a ring, held by a boy dressed like a carrot. He lands, does a spin, and barks once. Somewhere, a medieval child gasps as if he's seen magic. Because for him, he has. These performance dogs belong to traveling entertainers, sometimes solo minstrels, other times entire family troupes. They'd wander from town to town performing tricks in exchange for coins, bread, or a bed of hay behind the inn. They were beloved, especially in towns where entertainment was otherwise limited to mud wrestling gossip or watching paint flake off the church door. The dogs were trained using patience repetition and probably more bits of sausage than a dietitian would recommend. Some could balance on barrels, walk tight ropes, well wide, ropes retrieve hats, or pretend to count by barking. If a dog could hold a fake sword and fall over dramatically, you had a full Shakespearean tragedy, no script required. One particularly well-documented dog was Petit Jean, a terrier in 14th century France, known for playing dead whenever a trumpet sounded. He reportedly upstaged a human juggler during a bishop's feast and was given a roast partridge in reward. The juggler, meanwhile, got soup. Life's tough in showbiz. Now, not all shows were harmless. Some involved dancing bears, monkey acrobats, and other animals not nearly as thrilled to be there. But the dogs, they seemed to love it, or at least love the treats and the applause. Don't underestimate how much medieval dogs liked being clapped for. Many wore costumes, miniature tunics, bells on their paws, sometimes a silly hat or a little cape with tassels. Were these practical? Absolutely not. Were they adorable? Unquestionably, yes. And these shows weren't confined to the countryside. Dogs performed at fairs, noble gatherings, and occasionally even in royal courts. One English record mentions a troupe of canine comedians performing for a visiting French noble. The Frenchman reportedly laughed so hard he spilled his wine, which in medieval terms is the equivalent of a standing ovation. There's even some evidence of dogs being apprenticed to performers. A 15th century letter from a street jester to his brother mentions training a second hound to leap and sing like dear Olmo. Whether Olmo truly sang or just howled on cue is still being debated by exactly no one, but it's charming either way. And lest you think this was all novelty, consider this: these performances had structure. There were opening acts, climaxes, and finales. One performance ended with a dog rescuing a dummy princess from a fake dragon made of 2 kids in a sack and a painted mop for a tail. The crowd went wild. Even more fascinating, some of these dogs became local celebrities. In one Bohemian village, a dog named Luca was credited with reviving the local fair after years of dull attendance. The secret Luca danced on his hind legs and stole sausages from his trainer's pocket on cue. Merchants sold bread in the shape of Luca. A church even carved his likeness into a pew. No one knows why, but no one removed it either. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these performing dogs should be seen as exploited or adored. Some say it was unfair. Others say the dogs were treated better than half the humans in the troupe. Maybe it's a bit of both. But records consistently show affection dogs buried with tokens mourned in journals, even painted into folk art. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine Sir Boffin bowing to a sea of muddy feet and starry-eyed children. His little hat slips over one ear. Someone throws him a crust. And just for a moment, he is the most famous creature in town. 3 theatrical tidbits before the curtain falls. Some performers taught their dogs to faint on cue, usually during fake sword fights or romantic scenes gone wrong. In 15th century Spain, a troupe called Los Cuatro Patas, the 4 Paws, was known for staging entire dog plays complete with costumes and dramatic music. A Flemish tavern once claimed a performing dog as part of its entertainment license right next to 1 fiddle and 3 jokes. By now, you've met dogs who guarded castles, delivered cheese, performed comedy, and herded sheep like tiny furry managers. But tonight, we meet the medieval dogs who didn't just work beside nobles, they became part of the noble family. Sometimes, legally, you're seated in a high-ceilinged chamber lit by a flickering candelabra and full of people who look like they haven't smiled since the last harvest. It's a will reading, a serious occasion. The room hushes. The steward clears his throat. To my firstborn son, I leave my sword and title. To my faithful mastiff, Roland, I leave my vineyard. Yes, you heard that correctly. Roland the dog just inherited a working vineyard. Somewhere, a group of peasant tenants are about to get orders from a Labrador with a mild underbite. It sounds like a fable, but medieval Europe was full of cases where dogs weren't just beloved, they were heirs. In noble circles, dogs were often treated with such affection and occasionally obsession that they were written into legal documents. In some cases, not just mentioned, but granted land titles or lifelong pensions in meat and housing. One of the most cited examples is from 15th century France, where a noblewoman left part of her estate to her lapdog Fleur, specifying that her servants must prepare warm broth every morning and place it upon a silver tray. This was not symbolic. This was enforced. The dog had a servant, a schedule, and according to a local note opinions. Why did this happen? Well, partly because dogs were truly seen as companions in the deepest sense, loyal, loving, and unlike certain relatives, unlikely to challenge a will in court. Giving land or wealth to a dog was sometimes a pointed message. I trust this animal more than you. Other times it was more gentle, just affection carried to legal extremes. One baron in England granted his dog Hugo a small cottage, along with a caretaker and a chicken allowance not to exceed 2 per week. The document specifies that Hugo enjoy the shade of the orchard without interference. It's part fairy tale, part passive-aggressive real estate clause, but it wasn't always taken lightly. In some places, these bequests sparked full-blown legal debates. Was a dog a person? Could they own things? Who speaks for the dog? One lawyer wrote somewhat wearily, "In the matter of Sir Bevis the terrier, it is the steward who feeds him who reaps the rent. The terrier barks, but does not write receipts." That didn't stop it from happening again. In Italy, a noble named Ottavio named his greyhound as spiritual heir and insisted that mass be held for the dog's soul annually. The priest tried to refuse. The estate's new owner, a cat person, if you're wondering, threatened to pull funding. The mass was held. Now, in some cases, the inheritance wasn't direct. The dog would be placed under the care of a trusted servant or relative with strict instructions and funding earmarked specifically for the dog's well-being. If those terms were broken, the estate could pass to someone else entirely. Nothing motivates a distant cousin quite like the threat of losing a manor because he forgot to fluff a dog's cushion. One particularly colorful story involves a greyhound named Alessandre, who was left a velvet bed daily pastries and his very own drinking goblet. When a new steward tried to downgrade Alessandre's meals, he reportedly received a note from the late Countess's ghost in a dream, instructing him to do better or else. The steward immediately reinstated the pastries. And don't mistake this for rare eccentricity. Across regions from Burgundy to Bavaria, there are documented cases of dogs being left pensions, burial plots, and in one incredible moment of over-the-top affection, a coat of arms. Yes, a heraldic dog crest. The dog couldn't wear it, of course, but it was painted on the walls of a family chapel right next to the actual ancestors. If you've ever wanted your family tree to include a spaniel in armor, you were born a few centuries too late. Naturally, scholars debate what these gestures meant. Some say they were symbolic a way for nobles to express emotion in a culture that often repressed it. Others argue it was simply medieval melodrama at its finest. But a third softer theory, it was love. The quiet daily kind. The kind that doesn't care about titles or property, just about having someone warm and loyal nearby when the nights are long. And that's something everyone understood. So tonight, as you lie there, imagine Roland the Mastiff tail gently thumping as he surveys his vineyard from the shade of a fig tree. He doesn't know what a will is. He doesn't need to. All he knows is that someone once loved him enough to say, "You'll be taken care of even when I'm gone." 3 stately facts to dream about. A few dogs were honored with actual funerals, including hymns, candles, and eulogies. One was reportedly mourned more than the Baron. Certain households hired dedicated dog stewards, whose only job was to manage the animal's estate. And no, you can't apply retroactively. The phrase to the dog, "My loyalty," appears in the margin of a noble's will, right above a scratched-out name of a nephew. Awkward. Let's pull open the heavy oak door of yet another castle hall, this one quieter than most, the kind where thick tapestries muffle every sound, and even the light feels like it's tiptoeing across the stone. And near the hearth, lounging on a pillow that might just be stuffed with swan down, lies a dog that's not just pampered, but monitored. His name is Theobald. He's a Saluki, long-legged elegant, shaped like a whisper, and he's recovering from a sore paw. Don't worry. He's being attended by an actual human, wearing linen, with herbs, and something that resembles a chart. Welcome to the medieval dog hospital. Yes, it was a thing. For some dogs, in noble households, especially those with prized hunting or companion dogs, care went far beyond rub some mud on it and hope. There were procedures. There were poultices. In some cases, brace yourself, there were schedules, because if a nobleman's hound was injured, the consequences went beyond heartbreak. It could mean missed hunts, social embarrassment, and if it was a particularly well-known dog, actual diplomatic inconvenience. Imagine canceling a royal hunt because Lord Alaric's greyhound sprained a toe. That's a lot of side-eye from the French ambassador. So nobles did what nobles do, they hired help. These canine caretakers weren't called veterinarians, since that term wouldn't come into formal use for centuries, but they knew what they were doing. Many were falconers or stable hands cross-trained in animal healing. Others were kennel masters whose job included everything from feeding to birthing to herbal treatment. And yes, they had manuals, or at least parts of manuals. In the Livre de Chasse, a 14th century hunting guide by Gaston Phoebus, entire sections are dedicated to the care and treatment of dogs. Remedies for limping, salves for skin irritation, even instructions for canine dental care. Let that sink in. There were people rubbing medieval toothpaste on their dogs. Some common treatments: honey and vinegar poultices for infected wounds, ground plantain and pig fat for swelling, heated cloth wraps for joint pain, and in one case, soothing songs and warm broth for anxiety. We are officially full circle. The really lucky dogs like Theobald might even get their own room, or at least a curtained-off corner with soft bedding and an assigned caretaker. It wasn't just about healing the wound. It was about making sure the dog felt emotionally supported, which, let's face it, is still more than most medieval humans got. And when dogs died, some noble households commissioned markers, small headstones, poems. One lady in Burgundy even had a miniature statue carved of her hound posed mid-leap ears, flying joy frozen in stone. His name was Corbin. He once chased a deer clear into a lake and came back with a duck instead. No one was mad. But while noble dogs got this kind of treatment, peasant dogs, not so much. Most of them relied on Hardy Jean's luck, and maybe a friendly neighbor with a cabbage poultice. That said, it wasn't entirely grim. Village dogs were often cared for communally, and if one got sick, someone would feed it broth. Dogs were family, even without the velvet. Now back to the big estates. Some had entire kennels that functioned more like medieval clinics. dogs were rotated in and out depending on their health. Bedding was changed daily. Special diets were given boiled oats, chopped liver, or if things were truly dire, goat's milk from a very irritated goat. One letter from a noblewoman to her sister in 1422 describes a hound recovering from a leg injury. He is most patient, save when the broth is late. Then he groans most pitifully. Dogs, it seems, have always known the value of drama. There's even evidence of canine convalescence travel. One greyhound belonging to a Danish prince was sent to the southern air for recovery, a sort of medieval dog spa retreat, with a handler and a priest, just in case. Naturally, scholars have opinions. Some argue these dog hospitals were merely symbolic, another extension of noble performance. Others see them as the roots of early veterinary medicine, driven not by compassion for animals in general, but by status preservation. Still others quietly admit that maybe, just maybe, people simply loved their dogs and wanted them to feel better. Tonight, Theobald shifts on his pillow. His bandage is soft, his broth is warm, and his handler is humming something in Latin. Outside, life is muddy and chaotic. But here, for one elegant four-legged soul, recovery is calm, careful, and surprisingly luxurious. 3 healing tidbits before we tuck in. In some noble courts, dogs recovering from injuries were assigned specific music, usually flute or harp, to soothe their disposition. Several medieval texts warn against feeding sick dogs too much eel, as it was believed to overheat their blood and confuse their thoughts. Medieval science, everyone. A 13th century French manuscript includes a diagram of a dog's leg labeled in Latin. It's unclear if the artist had ever actually seen a dog. A storm is coming, not the kind with thunder and fanfare, but the creeping sort. The kind that begins with a red sun and ends with a smashed gate. You're standing on the walls of a crumbling fortress, wind clawing at your cloak. The guards are nervous. The captain is counting arrows. And below, at the ready tail high and eyes sharp, is a dog named Gerard. He's not here for companionship. Gerard is trained for rescue. In a time when battle and disaster were constant guests, medieval people didn't just rely on dogs to hunt or herd, they relied on them to save lives. Picture it. The enemy breaches the outer wall. Arrows fly. Oil is spilled. Chaos swirls like a drunk tornado. In the smoke and shouting, someone cries out. They're wounded, lost in the rubble, or trapped in the cellar of a burning building. Enter Gerard. He's already moving, sniffing, barking once to alert, pawing at stones until someone listens. And when they do, they find a breathing body under the broken beam, a heartbeat under dust, a miracle wearing fur. These were the early rescue dogs, not officially titled as such, but trained through instinct, routine, and loyalty. Some were battlefield companions. They followed their knights into war, stayed beside them through the din, and if the night fell, the dog stayed, or found help. There are accounts of war dogs pulling wounded men to safety, licking their faces to keep them conscious, even dragging limbs to find a medic. Now, were these stories exaggerated? Maybe a little. But the pattern is there, over and over again. One story from the Siege of Limoges in 1370 tells of a dog who led villagers to survivors hidden beneath a collapsed bakery. The dog refused to leave the site, howling, until someone dug. They found 3 people and half a loaf of bread, somehow still intact. The dog was named Cruton for it, of course. Another tale preserved in the record of a Breton abbey describes a dog who swam across floodwaters carrying a rope tied to a rescue raft. No one ordered it. It just did. The monks said it had the soul of a saint and the tail of a heretic, poetic and confusing. And these weren't rare outliers. In mountainous regions, dogs were used in snowstorms and rock slides. In flooded towns, they were trained to bark at submerged doors. In battlefield encampments, they sniffed through tent rows after raids, seeking out those who couldn't call for help. There are even sketches in 14th century military codices of dogs wearing light harnesses, possibly for carrying bandages, tools, or even small flasks of wine. Because nothing says you're going to make it like a Labrador bringing you Pinot Gris in the middle of a siege. And then there's the emotional rescue. A noblewoman in Silesia wrote of her lapdog, who refused to leave her side during an attack on their manor. While men fled and doors were broken, she writes only he stayed, teeth bared, heart steady, like the smallest knight of all. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes the dog simply finds you, in the dark, in the panic, in the aftermath. It's not even about dragging you to safety. It's about keeping you from disappearing. About saying, I see you. I won't leave. Academic debates here are surprisingly gentle. Most scholars agree dogs in medieval disasters weren't just present, they were purposeful. Some even argue that these dogs formed the basis for later formal rescue dog training, especially in mountainous monastic orders, like the precursors to the St. Bernard breeds. There are few formal records. These weren't jobs people wrote songs about. But in the margins and personal letters and quiet chapel notes, in the stories passed down over winter fires, you hear about them. Over and over. Dogs who found. Dogs who saved. And Gerard. He's not done. The walls are holding for now, but he's already alert. Someone might need him. And when they do, he won't hesitate. Because while the fortress may fall, Gerard knows his duty. It isn't glory. It's presence. It's staying with you when the dust rises. Tonight, as you breathe slowly and the world quiets, picture him padding softly through smoke and stone, following the smallest sound, the faintest scent. And somewhere because of him, someone wakes up who wouldn't have. 3 brave facts to remember when things get heavy. Some medieval military manuals mention dogs as scouts of the soul used to search camps after battles, especially in fog or nightfall. Certain noble families bred dogs specifically for guardian instinct, favoring those who stayed with the fallen over those who pursued the fleeing. A Bohemian folktale speaks of a ghostly dog who appears after avalanches, leading rescuers with glowing eyes and a silent bark. Spoiler, they think it's based on a real dog named Brenique. It's quiet now, not battlefield quiet, but that eerie stillness found behind silk curtains and stone corridors. You're inside a royal court. Everything here smells faintly of beeswax perfume and rules. There's a harp playing softly in the corner, a servant walking with exactly the right number of steps per minute, and in the middle of it all, a dog with better posture than most dukes. She's called Alizette, and she belongs to the queen. But don't let her petite frame and shiny collar fool you. Alizette runs this court. Politely, of course. You're in the presence of a royal dog. Unlike castle guards or hunting hounds, these dogs didn't need to earn their keep through sweat or strength. Their job was more subtle and somehow more powerful. They were symbols of class, of control, of a household so orderly, even its animals obeyed etiquette. You see, royal dogs weren't merely pets. They were extensions of their owners. And in the tangled hierarchy of medieval court life, where even a misplaced napkin could cause a scandal, having a dog was both comfort and strategy. Alizette doesn't bark unless addressed. She greets guests with a soft tail wag and an evaluating stare. If she doesn't like you, no one will say it out loud, but a servant might suddenly forget your wine. If she does like you well, congratulations. The queen might remember your name. It's not just court gossip. There are records dozens of dogs being raised within royal nurseries, appearing in family portraits, and even being used in diplomatic meetings. A king might stroke a dog during tense negotiations, not because he's nervous, but because it subtly reminds the other side, I am calm. I have everything, even this perfect little animal. Royal dogs had attendants, literally. A dog valet might be assigned to brush feed and walk the dog always discreetly, preferably in slippers. Their food was often prepared in the same kitchens as the queen's, though served in separate dishes, occasionally warmed. One royal chef in France in 1439 recorded a week's worth of meals for the Dauphin's spaniel stewed lamb with crushed barley-boiled partridge with herb oil, and on feast days tiny quail pies. It's unclear if the dog preferred crust or filling, and they dressed, of course. Collars were adorned with gold thread, tiny bells, or precious stones. Not because the dog wanted them, but because the court needed to see them. There's a surviving collar from the 14th century that reads, I belong to no man but the queen. Touch me not. Iconic, frankly. But royal dogs also carried a strange burden. They were beloved but rarely free. Everything they did was seen, watched, judged. There's a heartbreaking letter from a lady-in-waiting describing how the queen's dog trembled when the king raised his voice. Not because it was struck, but because the atmosphere changed. And royal dogs, like royal children, learned early how to read a room, and yet their presence mattered deeply. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria reportedly insisted her spaniel be allowed to sleep beside her, even during travel. When courtiers complained, she replied, "He bites less than most of you," which honestly deserves applause. There's also the legend of Prince Edric of Lotharingia, who was said to have danced only once in his life with his greyhound under moonlight after a long day of court politics. It might be myth, but it's a soft one. Academic minds debate whether these royal dogs were truly loved or just props. Some argue they were living ornaments, while others point to letters, paintings, and wills filled with affection. A particularly sweet entry comes from Princess Matilda of England. When I cry, he places his paw on my hand. When I laugh, he spins in circles. I suspect he knows me better than my ladies. And then there's the peculiar truth. Royal dogs were often lonely. Surrounded by velvet and ceremony, they couldn't roughhouse like village mutts or chase birds through muddy gardens. Their lives were structured, polished, displayed. Some coped, others sulked. There's even a record of a royal dog who refused to eat for 3 days after its companion was sent to another estate. The solution: bring the companion back immediately. So tonight, as you lie still and the world hushes around you, think of Alizette curled at the queen's feet. The fire crackles. The harp plays something slow. The queen runs a hand gently over soft ears, saying nothing, but somehow saying everything. 3 courtly tidbits for your dreams. In some courts, royal dogs had titles like Guardian of the Cushion or First Lapdog. Unclear what their duties were, but the vibes impeccable. One king allegedly had a tutor read aloud to his dog to maintain refinement of presence. The dog reportedly fell asleep, as one should. A royal decree from Burgundy once punished a courtier for stepping on the queen's dog's tail. Sentence kitchen duty. For a month. Justice. The breeze tonight smells faintly of sweet hay and political tension, which can only mean one thing: someone's traveling. Not just any someone. A royal, a noble, or maybe a bishop with too many bags and not enough humility. The caravan winds slowly through the countryside, dust trailing like a second procession, and trotting ahead, a small, dignified dog. His name is Baudry, and he's not just a loyal companion. He's a diplomatic gift. You've arrived at a fascinating intersection of fur and foreign policy. The medieval tradition of gifting dogs as part of negotiations, treaties, and polite flattery. Because when humans didn't trust each other, they often turned to animals, specifically ones with floppy ears and big soulful eyes. Let's rewind. Imagine two kingdoms teetering on the edge of conflict. Messengers go back and forth, letters are wax sealed with increasing urgency, and then out of nowhere, one side sends a dog. A rare breed, trained, groomed, wrapped in silk, and carried in a carved box like a precious gem. Why a dog? Because it said things words couldn't. This gift is loyal, obedient, and noble. May our alliance be the same. Also, we're wealthy enough to give away this beauty. Please be impressed. And finally, here's a living thing that requires care, just like peace. Baudry, tonight's example, is headed for a court 3 valleys away. He's a smooth-coated spaniel with ears like melted butter and the diplomatic temperament of a seasoned ambassador. He'll be presented at a banquet with a scroll, a bow, and possibly a fanfare. People will clap. Someone might cry. Baudry will sniff a goblet and pretend not to notice that the queen's lapdog looks vaguely offended. Historical records confirm this was not rare. In the 13th century, King Frederick II of Sicily reportedly sent hunting dogs to the Sultan of Egypt, not just as sport animals, but as a sign of shared nobility. In return, he received leopards. The dogs were thrilled. The leopards less so. In England, noble families often exchanged dogs across borders to seal marriages. A French greyhound for an English bride. A Flemish mastiff to accompany a dowry. Sometimes the dogs traveled faster than the marriage negotiations. One particularly dramatic episode comes from Burgundy in the 1420s, where a disagreement over the type of dog gifted nearly led to insult. The local duke sent a shaggy sheepdog instead of a sleek greyhound. The receiving court interpreted it as an accusation of rustic incompetence. 3 apologies and 1 very fancy greyhound, later peace was restored. Academic footnote: some scholars believe the breed of the dog was carefully chosen to reflect how one side perceived the other. A loyal hound implied trust. A sighthound implied speed and nobility. A lapdog, well, that was flattery wrapped in fluff, but not all dog diplomacy was grand. Sometimes the gesture was simple, a token of affection between allies. A noblewoman might send her sister-in-law a pair of puppies to warm her hearth and heart. One letter from a Spanish countess includes the phrase, "He is small, quiet, and dreams often, like your husband." It's not entirely clear if that was praise. And then there were the incidents. Dogs sometimes cause scandal. One ambassador brought a dog who barked at a bishop's shoes and was accused of being blessed with judgment. Another reportedly lifted its leg during a treaty signing. The treaty still passed. The carpet, however, did not survive. But mostly, these dogs worked their quiet magic. They softened tension. They broke the ice. They offered a rare moment of mutual admiration between people who otherwise only shared distrust. A dog might curl at a queen's feet while her advisors argued. It might follow a prince on a tour of the gardens while he decided whether or not to marry someone he'd never met. And sometimes the dog was remembered more than the deal itself. One German chronicle mentions a spaniel of chestnut coat who remained in the court of the Danes long after the alliance faded and was buried beside the youngest prince. Baudry, meanwhile, arrives safely. He's offered roasted partridge, a cushion by the fire, and several soft gasps of admiration. The queen strokes his head once, and the whole room takes it as a sign things are going well. You may not see him again, or you might painted quietly in the background of a treaty illustration, eyes wise paws politely crossed. Tonight, as your own world grows, still, imagine Baudry sleeping soundly in a foreign castle, dreaming of home, but wagging gently in his sleep. 3 facts to send you gently across borders. Some diplomatic dogs wore ribbons with miniature scrolls tied around their collars containing poems or greetings in formal Latin. In a 15th century Scottish court, a gifted dog was appointed canine companion to the Queen's reading hour. The dog reportedly snored throughout. A failed alliance in Hungary was blamed half-jokingly on the jealousy of the palace hounds. Honestly, we've seen pettier reasons. The sun is setting now, not the dramatic gold-flamed kind, but the slow, weary descent of a day full of hard truths. You're standing near a small rural chapel, watching a procession move quietly along the path. No trumpets, no fanfare, just footsteps, a few murmured prayers, and one unexpected figure walking in front of the bier. A dog, gray-muzzled, slow, but purposeful. He's not leading the way. He's not following orders. He's just there. Because tonight, we enter a chapter both tender and strange, the way medieval people mourned with dogs, and sometimes mourned for them. Grief in the Middle Ages was a complicated thing. Public, symbolic, often scripted. But amidst all the incense and robes, enchanted Latin dogs found a quiet, permanent place. When their owners died, they stayed close. And sometimes, they were allowed just once to break the rules of rank, class, or ceremony. The dog at the funeral, that's real. There are stories from across Europe of dogs lying at the foot of their deceased masters' coffins refusing to move. One chronicler from York writes of a hound named Caedmon who howled through an entire vigil mass. None could quiet him, so they let him cry. In noble households, it went further. Some dogs were mentioned in the will not just for inheritance, as we've seen, but for mourning instructions. One baron specified that his mastiff, Geralt, be permitted to attend his burial, so that his silence may stand in place of weeping. Another asked that his hound be allowed to sleep in his chambers for 7 nights, lest he be troubled by absence. Poetic maybe, practical also yes, because dogs noticed. When the routine broke, when a voice went quiet, when a scent disappeared, they knew. And sometimes they acted on it. There's a haunting tale from Florence about a merchant's dog who waited at the church door for 13 days after the funeral. People brought him food. He never ate. On the 14th day, he left and wasn't seen again. Local legend says he went to the hills looking for his master's hunting path, but even beyond stories, there were customs. In some regions, a family might invite the deceased's dog to sit near the mourners, believing its presence would calm the grieving. In others, dogs were gently turned away as their cries were considered too heartbreaking. In one German village, it was believed that a dog's yawn during a funeral meant the spirit had passed safely. And what of dogs who died first? They were buried sometimes plainly, sometimes ceremoniously. A few noble dogs were laid to rest in small garden tombs with their names carved above them. One princess had a statue built for her spaniel Adele in a chapel corner. The inscription reads, "She guarded my soul better than I guarded hers." Academic debate gets lively here. Some historians argue this was mere anthropomorphism projecting human emotion onto loyal animals. Others see it as a true reflection of daily intimacy. Dogs weren't just pets, they were witnesses to births, illnesses, secrets, prayers. They saw you when no one else did. And when you left, they noticed. Monks, ever the record keepers, sometimes documented dogs' reactions to death. One Cistercian journal tells of a dog who lay beside a dying brother, then refused to leave his bed for a week. Another monk noted, "The beast mourned without shame. I envied him." Then there's the stranger side. In a handful of folk traditions, dogs were believed to act as guides for souls, not to judge, but to walk with. A companion through that uncertain darkness. Some called them silent escorts. In Breton myth, there's a chien de deuil, a spectral mourning dog who appears beside those with heavy hearts, offering comfort through presence alone. And here's the most peculiar one. In certain areas, it was believed that if a dog howled during a funeral, it was chasing away evil spirits, trying to claim the soul. If that's true, then medieval dogs weren't just mourners, they were guardians, spiritual bodyguards in a world obsessed with heaven, hell, and the long road in between. Tonight the procession ends. The priest whispers, the candle flickers, and the dog, he lies down by the stone. No leash, no command, just a sense that this is where he belongs for now. You pull your blanket a little closer, because somewhere deep inside you, something recognizes that gesture staying near, without words, when goodbyes are too large for language. 3 soft lingering notes to close with. A 14th century noblewoman from Savoy included a request in her will that a blanket be placed over her grave, beneath which her dog may sleep at will. In rural France, some grieving families placed their dog's paw print in wet clay, then kept it beside religious icons to honor the bond. A medieval chapel in the Scottish Highlands features a carving of a knight sword sheathed with a dog curled at his feet. It's the only figure in the whole wall, relief not looking toward heaven, just toward him. It's market day again, and the village square is full of shouting, wheezing donkeys, suspicious sausages, and the gentle chaos of people pretending they agree on prices. But just beyond the commotion, in a small timber-framed building with cracked glass windows and a gavel that's been dropped more times than swung a trial is underway, and sitting quietly in the back row, a dog. Now, before you ask, no, he's not on trial. Not yet. Tonight we step into the deeply strange and unintentionally comedic world of medieval justice, where dogs didn't just guard the law, they sometimes participated in it. Let's begin with the village court, or manorial court, where land disputes, petty crimes, and moral disagreements were settled weekly over ale parchment and a generous helping of local gossip. Most villagers came to complain about fences missing pigs, or who stole whose turnip barrel. But sometimes, the cases got weird. Dogs appeared in these courts in several bizarre ways. Sometimes they were evidence. If a dog barked at a thief, people would say, "Aha." Even the hound knows he's guilty. In one recorded case, from 1314, A man was fined after a dog barked at him 3 times in front of the reeve. The dog was treated as a creature of God's judgment. The man less so. Other times, dogs were victims. If a dog was harmed, especially if it belonged to a respected villager, charges could be brought. One shepherd was publicly scolded and fined a goat for kicking another man's dog in anger and without prayer. Yes, that's how the record put it. And in rare but very real situations, dogs were defendants. Yes, medieval Europe occasionally put dogs on trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually on trial. With witnesses' testimony, and sometimes brace yourself a defense attorney. Charges ranged from theft and destruction of property to biting, and in deeply superstitious areas, accusations of being in league with witches. There's a chillingly hilarious account from Flanders in the 15th century where a dog was put on trial for stealing bread from the Lord's table. The defense argued the dog acted out of hunger, not rebellion. The court deliberated. The dog was pardoned, but banned from the manor for 3 weeks. You truly can't make this stuff up. Sometimes the dog never appeared. They were tried in absentia, usually when they'd run off. One record simply states, the hound known as Bran did not attend court, and is therefore declared fugitive. Honestly, same. But it wasn't all ridiculous. Dogs were also guardians of the court. Bailiffs and officials often kept large, well-trained hounds by their side, both for security and intimidation. A dog standing beside a court official gave weight to proceedings, especially when people were known to arrive drunk, angry, or with a strongly worded carrot. In fact, some villages had court dogs, animals raised around the judicial process, known by locals and allowed to wander in and out of hearings. One such dog, named Frala, is mentioned in multiple entries of a southern German court record, always lying beside the scribe's desk. In one rare note, the scribe adds, Frala growled at the brewer. The brewer was found guilty. Not exactly unbiased, but deeply satisfying. Scholars today debate what all this says about medieval justice. Some argue it reflects an animist worldview, where animals were part of the moral universe. Others see it as symbolic dogs, representing loyalty judgment, or the voice of the village. A few say it's just evidence that people have always found ways to include their pets in everything, even bureaucracy. And you know what? All of that might be true. Tonight, the trial ends. A fence dispute is resolved with sighs. A runaway goose is declared public property, and Frala. He gets a bone tossed under the bench. No robe, no speech. Just a tail wag and the quiet satisfaction of another judgment passed. 3 courtly curiosities before we adjourn. In 14th century France, a dog was once given a formal pardon by a bishop after being accused of spiritual interruption during Mass. The bishop blessed him with a sprig of rosemary. The phrase "by dog's witness" appears in a handful of rural English court records, often used when no human would testify. A dog in medieval Poland was acquitted after witnesses claimed he only bit the man because the man insulted him first. It's dusk again, and you're standing beside a loaded cart, swaying slightly with every creak of the wheels. The driver mutters to himself in a dialect only partially made of words, and the mule looks like it's reconsidering all life choices. But running just ahead, ears-perked eyes, sharp paws, almost silent, is a dog named Brusque. Brusque isn't sniffing for rabbits. He's not herding sheep or putting on a show. Brusque is here for one reason only, to protect the goods. Tonight, You ride with the merchant guards, those who carried breadcloth spices or coin along medieval trade roads that were often less commercial route and more choose-your-own mugging. While most people think of knights as the protectors of medieval order, the real day-to-day defense force often had 4 legs and an incredible nose. Guard dogs like Brusque were essential to roadside safety, especially for traders who couldn't afford a full-armed escort, but still had things people might want to steal, like salted fish or buttons. And the roads, they were wild. Bandits roamed. Wolves roamed. Occasionally, both teamed up for maximum inconvenience. Forests where thick signage was non-existent, and the only maps you had were drawn by someone who thought north was a suggestion. Dogs weren't just helpful. They were lifelines. Brusque, like many working dogs, had his training early. He'd walk ahead, sniffing for danger. He'd growl if anything moved wrong. At night, he'd sleep beside the wagon wheels, tail-curled ears twitching with every twig snap. If someone approached while the driver dozed, Brusque barked. If they didn't back off, Brusque bit. There's a record from a Flemish merchant's journal in 1392 describing a dog who fought 3 robbers near the tree with a broken arm, which is either a tree branch or a very specific landmark. The dog reportedly held one attacker by the leg while the driver escaped. Later, the dog was rewarded with sausages and a very good brushing. Some dogs were trained not just to guard, but to alert and track. If a thief grabbed something and ran, the dog would follow and sometimes return with the stolen item. There's a tale from Provence of a hound who retrieved a missing coin purse by dragging the thief's cloak back to camp. He was given a name that day, Courage. Also 3 chickens. Guard dogs weren't always big either. While mastiffs were common for muscle, smaller terrier breeds were used in tight places like alleyways or inside traveling wagons. They were fast, fierce, and surprisingly sneaky. One merchant described his dog as small, sharp, and capable of chewing through a purse or a person. And let's talk outfits. Because yes, some guard dogs wore armor. Okay, maybe not full suits. But leather harnesses with metal studs were fairly common. Not just for show, but for protection. Thieves didn't always carry swords. Sometimes it was club spears or just very large sticks. A good harness could mean the difference between a brave bark and a sad limp. In more organized caravans, dogs were even assigned shifts. One walked ahead. One walked behind. One stayed with the cook wagon, smartest job honestly. They weren't just muscle, they were members of the route. And here's the strangely sweet part. Merchants often wrote about their dogs in their travel logs more lovingly than their co-workers. You'll find entries like Willem slowed the group again, with his whining immediately followed by Brusque was good today, chased off a fox, got extra scraps. Academics point out that dogs served not only as defense, but as emotional anchors during long, dangerous journeys. They were something stable, predictable. When every stranger might be a threat, a dog was proof that loyalty still existed. Tonight, Brusque pauses at the edge of a wooded bend. He sniffs the air, growls once. Nothing comes of it, but that's the point. You'll never know how many problems a dog like him prevented just by being present. You reach into the back of the cart, toss him a crust of rye. He catches it mid-air without breaking eye contact with the dark beyond the road. Just another night on duty. 3 travel-safe facts before we set up camp. Certain trade guilds paid bonuses to merchants who employed dogs, considering it a form of preventative cost reduction. Medieval insurance but furry. Some dogs were trained to walk under carts to avoid arrows or surprise attacks popping out only when needed. Like very patient landmines, one preserved merchant's log includes a tally of expenses, flour wax ale, dog bread, and new boots for Brusque. Priorities clearly. You're deep in the countryside now, where the fields roll in crooked rows, and the scarecrows are doing their best despite obvious limitations. The harvest moon is rising fat and golden, and the villagers are gathering near the stone circle, not for a feast, but for something older, something quieter, something a little uncanny. And they're seated beside the oldest woman in the village, wearing a garland of herbs, and a very serious expression is a dog. His name is Tirluin, and tonight he isn't a pet or a guard. He's a participant in a ceremony. Tonight's story isn't about knights or noble courts. It's about the odd, earthy rituals of medieval villages, where dogs were more than tools or companions. They were symbols, sacred helpers in the seasonal dance of folklore and faith. Because while the church kept its saints and altars, the people had other traditions. Traditions where dogs weren't just animals, they were spiritual intermediaries. Let's start with the harvest. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially the Celtic and Slavic-influenced regions, the end of the growing season was marked with a festival not just of abundance, but of thresholds. The boundary between the living and the dead thinned. Fires were lit, offerings were made, and sometimes a dog was chosen to walk the perimeter of the field, either alone or with a handler as a kind of guardian spirit. If the dog completed the circuit without barking or stopping, it was said the harvest was protected and the coming winter would be kind. If the dog refused to walk the circuit, well, you might want to store extra onions. Dogs were also invited, sometimes expected to be present at births, deaths, and weddings held in these semi-pagan ceremonies. Their behavior was read like omens. A bark during a wedding was a blessing. A growl during a funeral meant unfinished business. In one alpine village, a ritual called the Night Hound's Watch took place every autumn. A dog, usually the oldest in the village, would lie beside the sacred fire until dawn. If it stayed awake, the village would be safe from plague. If it fell asleep, double the garlic next season. And yes, garlic was currency in more ways than one. But the stories don't stop there. Dogs were seen as threshold beings, creatures who moved between the wild and the domestic, the instinctual and the obedient. That made them perfect symbols for anything involving transition, birth, death, coming of age, or even the changing of seasons. One folktale from southern France tells of a black dog who appeared every winter solstice to lead the lost back to their homes. If you fed him bread, he'd guide you without fail. If you ignored him, your shoes would never dry again. A deeply specific curse. And don't overlook the herbal garlands. In certain ceremonies, dogs were adorned with wreaths of rue sage or mugwort, not for decoration, but protection. One account from the Carpathians mentions a dog named Duban, who wore a crown of bitter leaves and was said to see the spirits before the bell. This blending of folklore and function was common. Dogs helped with real things, herding, guarding, tracking, but they also filled a need that was harder to name: the need to believe something watched over you, even if it walked on four legs. Academics call this folk syncretism, the blending of older earth-based beliefs with the rising dominance of organized religion. Villagers might attend Mass on Sunday, and then quietly let the village dog lead the May Day procession, just in case. Tirlewin shifts now, ears twitching as the drums begin. He doesn't howl. He doesn't chase shadows. He simply stands and walks once in a slow circle around the gathered crowd. The fire crackles. The old woman nods. The blessing is complete. You're not sure what it meant, but you feel safer. 3 mystical mutt facts for your twilight thoughts. In some regions, a newborn child wasn't considered fully welcomed until a village dog licked their feet during a naming ritual. The phrase, dog at the circle, appears in over a dozen seasonal rite records, often without explanation, suggesting everyone just knew. A German folktale warns, if a dog stares at a corner for too long on All Hallows Eve, don't ask what he sees. Thank him, then leave. You're back in the village square, but it's not a market day, and there's no music or roast geese this time. People are gathered in uncomfortable silence, faces, pale expressions caught somewhere between embarrassment and morbid curiosity. At the center, tied gently to a post, is a dog. His name is Milo. He is for all appearances quite calm, which is more than you can say for the bailiff who's sweating through his robes. Because tonight, for reasons both ridiculous and unsettling, a dog is about to be put on trial. Yes, a real trial. With a charge, a judge witnesses, and in one deeply confusing case, a tiny scroll labeled Exhibit A. Welcome to one of the strangest corners of medieval justice animal trials, particularly those involving dogs who were accused of crimes, often petty, sometimes absurd, occasionally theological. Let's rewind. In parts of Europe, especially France, Switzerland, and bits of the Holy Roman Empire, it wasn't uncommon for animals to be charged with wrongdoing. Livestock might be blamed for crop failure. Pigs could be tried for biting a child. And dogs. Dogs, unfortunately, were frequent defendants in anything that involved chaos. If a dog barked during a procession, it might be accused of disrupting divine order. If a dog bit someone important, it could be labeled a violator of peace. And if a dog was simply found at the wrong place, say next to a murdered chicken, it might be suspected of complicity. Now, not all these trials were formal. Some were theatrical. Public morality plays with a four-legged scapegoat. But others, they were deadly serious. There's a record from 1457 in Savigny, France, where a dog was tried for accompanying a man who committed murder. The man fled. The dog stayed. The court, not knowing what else to do, put the dog on trial for aiding and abetting. Testimonies were heard. The village priest was consulted. The verdict was execution. It sounds absurd because it is. But in a world where the line between sin, omen, and action was razor thin, people projected guilt onto anything they could understand. And dogs. They were familiar, emotional, and sometimes available. Some dogs were acquitted, though. In a small German hamlet, a dog was charged with intentional defecation in front of the parish doors during a funeral. A witness claimed it was an act of protest. Another argued the dog was simply unwell. The scribe concluded the beast meant no slight to the dead. Case closed. And in at least one instance, a dog had legal representation. A cleric named Father Renard, known for his empathy and his refusal to eat meat during Lent, argued passionately on behalf of a shepherd's dog accused of stealing blessed bread. His argument, he stole, yes, but he shared it with the poor. The dog was spared, The bread not so much. But beyond the comedy, these trials raise difficult questions. Did people truly believe animals understood guilt? Or were these ceremonies just a way for communities to process fear disorder and the need for someone to blame? Were dogs standing in for absent humans? Or were they genuinely seen as moral actors? Modern scholars are split. Some see it as judicial theater public rituals to reaffirm the power of the court and distract from the real human mess. Others argue that in the medieval worldview, animals had souls, or at least behaviors that could reflect human vices. A snarling dog wasn't just scary, it might be harboring wrath. And then there's the simpler explanation: people were scared. Of disease, of sin, of losing control. And when you're scared, it's oddly comforting to believe that even a dog can be held accountable. Tonight, Malo is pardoned. The jury, perhaps tired or simply charmed, declares him more loyal than harmful. He's untied. The crowd exhales. A child claps. The bailiff sneezes. Milo shakes, once licks his nose, and walks calmly toward the tavern. Honestly, same. 3 odd, but real trial tidbits to reflect on. In some regions, if a dog was convicted, the owner could appeal, resulting in a trial within a trial. Yes, a legal drama with extra barking. A Swiss village kept a book of beasts where all animal infractions were recorded, including one entry: dog barked during sermon, soul unsettled. A 15th century French jurist wrote, "If beasts err, they do so in reflection of man. Punish them not to correct, but to remind." The candlelight flickers, and you're seated in a narrow room filled with parchment dust and the quiet frustration of a scribe whose quill just broke for the 3rd time tonight. He mutters something in Latin that's definitely not a prayer, dips a new quill into ink, and sighs. But across the desk from him, nose on paws, lies his companion, mildly snoring, gently dreaming. A dog, again, and this time, we're not here for their jobs coats or courtroom cameos. Tonight, we explore something subtler: how dogs wandered into the literature and symbolism of the medieval world. Because in between all the dragons, damsels, and overly dramatic knights, there were dogs. Not just as background fluff, but as metaphors, as messengers, as mirrors. Let's start with the bestiaires. Those beautifully illustrated books filled with animal lore and very questionable science. Dogs appear early and often. One entry reads, "The dog is faithful more than kin and knows the sin of man." Another insists that dogs can recognize the devil by scent alone, which explains why so many illustrations show them barking at bishops. Maybe. In these texts, dogs were held up as paragons of loyalty, guardianship, and humility, but also, interestingly, as testers of truth. One allegory describes a court where the only way to find a liar is to see whom the dog avoids. If the dog won't sit beside you, congratulations, you're guilty. In chivalric romances, dogs played more than symbolic roles. They were companions, yes, but also moral compass points. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a greyhound is said to turn away from a false knight before any duel begins. In Tristan and Isolde, the lover's dog, Hodane, refuses to leave the queen's side even after betrayal. Silent judgment in floppy form. And let's not forget the poets. Petrarch mourned his dog as a creature who knew more grace than I. Chaucer, ever the sly observer, noted how dogs often showed more courtly behavior than courtiers. In one of his tales, a man says, My hound would sooner keep his vow than 3 dukes in velvet. Burn. Even sermons borrowed the dog motif. Priests would refer to Christ as the faithful hound, ever watching, ever ready to guard. One particularly imaginative friar compared temptation to a bone and the soul to a dog who must decide whether to chew or walk away. If that sounds confusing, imagine it shouted at you for 40 minutes. But it wasn't always praise. In some satirical tales, dogs represented human flaws, greed, jealousy, or foolish loyalty. A popular fable tells of a dog who guards an empty cupboard, snarling at everyone despite having nothing worth protecting. The moral: beware the man who clings to pride more than purpose. Even the legal system got poetic with it. There's a record from a village council in 1365 that describes a corrupt official as a lapdog who bites only when bribed. Ouch. Accurate. And in folk songs, dogs were companions of the lost, the lovers, and the liars. One old English ballad tells of a knight who faked his death only to be found out when his dog dug up his cloak and dropped it at the village gate. He was captured. The dog got fed. Justice. Scholars still debate what these dog images truly meant. Were they placeholders for human emotion? Tools for teaching? Just popular because everyone knew what a dog looked like? The truth is likely all three. Dogs, after all, were part of daily life. They ate your scraps, slept at your feet, barked at your rivals. Of course, they slipped into your stories. And once they were in, they stayed quietly shaping how people thought about truth, loyalty, and the kind of courage that doesn't wear armor, but still stands guard. Tonight, the scribe finishes his line. He stretches. The dog opens, one eye blinks, and gently rests his head back down. The words are inked. The meaning already understood. 3 literary nibbles to ponder. A 14th century Italian poem refers to a faithful dog as the soul's shadow, 4-footed and without lies. In some illuminated manuscripts, dogs were drawn at the margins, chasing hares or knights, possibly for humor, possibly just because the monk was bored. One medieval proverb claims, "Trust a friend who brings his dog to visit. He fears neither judgment nor fleas." The morning mist is still clinging to the fields, and the air carries that gentle, muddy promise of spring. You're walking along a country lane now, one wheel rut at a time, when something trots past a wiry dog with a feathered tail and a nose twitching like it has somewhere important to be. He doesn't look ancient. He doesn't wear a crest or a velvet coat. But he feels old, like he's carrying echoes of footsteps that go back hundreds of years. Tonight, we come to the final chapter, the lingering legacy of those medieval dogs, the ones who worked, loved, watched, and wandered their way into our world. Because many of the breeds and behaviors we see today, they're not new. They're survivors. Let's start with the familiar, that collie herding geese on a foggy farm. He's the great something of a medieval sheepdog who once chased a runaway lamb into a monastery kitchen. That elegant greyhound stretching on someone's velvet sofa. Her ancestors ran beside falcons and knights praised in poetry painted into coats of arms. And the terrier that now lives in a studio apartment and protects it from mail carriers with righteous fury. 1,000 years ago, he guarded grain stores from rats and probably still complained about squirrels. Many modern dog breeds trace their roots directly to the jobs they performed in medieval society. Mastiffs once guarded castles. Their sheer size and solemn expressions made them both protector and deterrent. Today, They guard toddlers and snack drawers with equal intensity. Sight hounds, like Salukis and greyhounds, were bred for speed in open fields. Today they still run, but mostly to the couch before you can claim the good seat. Spaniels were hunting companions diving into brush for birds. These days, they fetch tennis balls and your heart. Herding dogs, like collies, corgis, and shepherds, carry the instincts of dogs who used to guide flocks across entire kingdoms. And yes, even little lapdogs, those with names like Lupo or Bijou, descend from pampered pups who once napped on royal cushions and were fed tiny pies on feast days. But beyond genetics, there's something deeper: the behavioral inheritance, the loyalty, the awareness, the way dogs still curl up beside you even when you're not saying much. That's not just nature, it's history with fur. In fact, some behaviors we now find endearing were once essential. Barking at strangers, medieval security system. Sitting at your feet during dinner. Strategic begging, developed from centuries of kitchen scraps. Running in circles before lying down, once a way to flatten grass in a field. Now, just part of the bedtime show. And even now, in training, manuals, working dog programs, and animal rescue centers, handlers speak of ancient instinct, a phrase that means this dog knows something old. It's also why stories of heroic dogs still resonate. Search and rescue dogs, therapy animals, loyal companions, they all remind us of the roles dogs once played, not just by our side, but with purpose. Medieval or modern, that part never changed. Some scholars say the emotional bond between humans and dogs is the longest-running interspecies friendship in history. Longer than horses, longer than cats, longer than anything we ever tried to tame and failed miserably at. Looking at you, geese. And perhaps the reason dogs stayed so close is because they asked for so little and gave so much. They learned our fears, our roots, our habits. And they never told anyone about the time we cried over burnt bread or danced alone in a field. So tonight, as you pull the blanket a little higher, imagine this: a dog centuries ago lying beside a fire. Rain on the thatched roof, his owner asleep. Outside, the wind stirs the hedgerow, but inside, the dog keeps watch. Not because he was told to, but because that's what he does. And that same promise passed down through generations still curls beside your bed, even if now it comes with squeaky toys and a surprisingly strong opinion about mailboxes. 3 soft, loyal facts to leave you with. Some modern working dog programs still trace breed lines to medieval roles, preserving instincts honed across hundreds of years. In certain rural villages, dogs are still blessed in spring festivals, just as they were in medieval field rites. A recent study found that dogs can recognize over 200 human words, but they still understand silence best. You're in the woods now, not the haunted kind, just quiet. The sort of place where every step crunches softly under leaves, and the air is thick with pine and thyme. It's not quite dawn, not quite dark. The hour when the world holds its breath. And somewhere nearby, behind a mossy stone and under a canopy of crooked branches, a dog is watching you. He isn't noble. He doesn't wear a coat or perform tricks or carry treaties. He's thin alert and entirely ordinary, which makes him extraordinary. Because tonight, we meet the dogs of myth legend and whispers the forgotten canines that lived not in castles, but in stories. In the medieval mind, Dogs weren't just real creatures. They were signs, omens, guides, sometimes saints, sometimes monsters, always something more. Let's start with the basics. In almost every European region, dogs appeared in folklore as protectors of souls. A faithful dog at your side was said to see what you could not. They were believed to sense ghosts, ward off curses, or lead you safely home when the road was fogged with more than just weather. Some of this was metaphor, but some people really believed it. In rural Brittany, people spoke of the chien noir, a black dog who would walk beside the recently widowed silently until they reached the graveyard gate. Not a threat, a comfort, a companion for sorrow. In the Swiss Alps, there were tales of dogs who barked 3 times before an avalanche, never once more, never once less. Miners and shepherds would say, "If the dog speaks thrice, we climb." Some medieval texts even included dogs in their spiritual frameworks. A few saints were said to be guarded by animals, especially in solitude. Saint Roch, often invoked during plagues, was famously accompanied by a dog who brought him bread every day while he recovered in the forest. That dog became his symbol, and in some regions, people prayed to both the saint and the dog. In that blurred border between real and imagined dogs ran freely. There's the Gabriel hound, in English folklore, a spectral pack whose howls warned of coming storms. There's the Barghest of northern England, a ghost dog with eyes like fire who would appear before death, but also curiously guard children lost in the moors. And in Slavic myths, there's the PSA douche, the soul dog, said to live half in shadow, half in light. When someone passed unjustly, the PSA douche would find the grave and dig just enough to loosen the anger so the spirit could rest. You might wonder, did people really believe these things? Maybe not all of them. But in a world where life was short, the nights were long, and death came without warning, the idea of a silent, watchful dog, one who stood at the gate between life and something else, was comforting. Dogs were, after all, already there. At the door, at the fire, at the feet of the dying. They didn't flinch. They didn't flee. If anyone could walk beside you into the dark and not ask why, it was a dog. Interestingly, medieval bestiaries, those illustrated animal encyclopedias, often gave dogs surprisingly high praise. "The dog is faithful," one text reads. "He follows his master even unto death. He guards his house. He returns always." In a section filled with fire-breathing lizards and questionable unicorns, dogs got respect. Even in dreams, dogs appeared as symbols of loyalty, instinct, or warning. A dream of a barking dog might mean betrayal. A dog sleeping peacefully at your feet, safe passage. And a dog walking away without looking back. You were being left behind by someone or something that mattered. One monk wrote in the margin of his psalter, "I dreamed again of the gray dog who stood at the gate but did not enter." What does he wait for? We'll never know. But I like to think the dog was just giving him time to catch up. And tonight, in your own soft-lit room, maybe you feel it too, that quiet sense of being watched over. Not in fear, not in judgment, just company. Imagine that dog now, the one no one else sees, curled at the edge of your bed, one ear flicking at dreams, one eye half open, not demanding, not asking, just there. 3 final truths, half folklore, half heartbeat. In some medieval towns, it was believed that a dog who barked at midnight saw more than people ever could. You were supposed to whisper thanks and go back to bed. A 15th century monk's journal includes a prayer: "May I be found worthy to walk beside the hound at heaven's gate." And in one village in Bohemia, it was tradition to leave a piece of bread at the door on All Souls' Night for the good dog who walks between stars. Ket. So here we are, friend. 15 parts, 1,000 paw prints, and centuries of quiet footsteps behind us. You've wandered through castles and cottages, banquet halls, and shepherd fields, ghost stories and gardens. And through it all, one figure stayed close, not always in armor, not always in silk, sometimes working, sometimes waiting, but always there. The dog, faithful in fog, loyal in love, fierce in duty, and at the end of every long medieval day, ready to lie beside your fire and watch the world settle down. Maybe that's what drew us here tonight. Not the battles, not the history books, but the soft shape of a presence that didn't need words. Just warmth, just company, just a sense that someone's watching the door while you rest. You didn't need to command it. You didn't have to earn it. It just was. So as your room grows still and your thoughts soften into something slower, I hope you can imagine it one last time. The hush of an old stone room, the hush of modern night, and a dog. Your dog, maybe not needing anything, but to be near. And as sleep rises like fog over your thoughts, know this: you've made it safely through the dark. There's nothing more to guard. The fire is low. The hour is late. The quiet has come. And someone just out of sight is keeping watch. That's the story. For tonight, may your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.